Hello, Wear Many Hats listeners. It is me, Mark Robinson. I am back for another episode of Wear Many Hats, the facilities management podcast, probably the only one that's available really in Europe at the minute. We've been having some fantastic guests recently. I hope that you're enjoying the content. Please, as ever, like, follow and share so that we can get more followers and bring the message that we're trying to say with regards to the facilities management industry out to more people, which is fantastic. Today, absolutely excited to be joined by Carl Brooks. Carl Brooks, bear with me. I need to get your title right, Carl. We'll edit this out. Is the Global Head of ESG for Property Management at CBRE. Hello, Carl. How you doing?
Very well, thank you. Good to be here. Thanks for inviting me on.
You having a good day?
So far, so good.
Have you come far?
Today, not too far, just from our head office at Henrietta House. I'm just in the West End, but yeah, home is Southampton on the south coast. So,
really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's all right, isn't it?
Not too bad at all.
It's not too shabby at all. Do you follow the Saints? Or?
The accent wouldn't lead you to believe that, but my dad is a Scouser, so I am a Liverpool fan.
Not another one.
So no. I'm afraid so. Keeping close on the table this season.
No, I'm a United fan.
Well, it was the first time ever I supported Man United was this weekend, and you failed us. So it's,
I know we did do a very terrible job.
You helped City,
but hell of a banging goal from Marcus Rashford. Though.
Well, indeed,
that was a good goal.
Indeed,
but we got 1 minute of joy out of 90 minutes of pain.
There you go.
That's the best way to explain it. Good game coming up this weekend, though. You guys in City.
Fingers crossed for the right result.
Yeah. What about Arsenal? Are you worried about them?
All we got to do is keep winning.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
That's true. You are doing very well at that.
So far, so good. It would be nice to send Klopp off with another title under his belt.
Yeah. He's only won one, hasn't he?
He has, and it was behind closed doors mid-COVID. So
clearly not as good as everyone says he is.
Maybe not.
How many did Ferguson win? 13.
Yeah.
I'm going to live in history vicariously. Lovely. All right, Carl. Absolutely brilliant. Listen, thank you very much for joining us today.
No problem.
Obviously, you've had quite an interesting career, so I always like to start with talk us through it. Tell us how you started, how your education panned out, where you went, how you got there, and so on and so forth.
Sure. So I guess I'm probably what's classed as a veteran of the sustainability kind of industry. It's all I've ever done. So this is going into my 25th year as a sustainability professional. I read environmental science at university. I've always been interested in human interaction with the environment and how we are sort of, kind of impacting it and how we might be able to actually sort of like reverse some of those impacts.
Yeah.
So childhood very much formed by sort of things like the Exxon Valdez disaster and the first kind of Earth Summit, the Rio Earth Summit in 1990.
Yeah.
So very sort of prevalent in my sort of forming my view of what was important. Very randomly, the course I was on allowed you to specialize in certain areas, and I chose to specialize in the human and built environment just to really sort of focus more on kind of how we kind of shape, affect, influence, impact our planet. Did my sort of thesis project on the impact of out-of-town shopping on urban sort of urban centres.
So what drove that? What drove that decision? Because I'm guessing there was other things that you could have gone, routes you could have gone down as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But always been very sort of curious about sort of the human condition and just how we interact with one another and how we sort of interact with our sort of fundamentally our sort of life support systems and what would lead people down the route of thinking that degrading the planet was a good course of action and really wanting to kind of explore that a bit more. So that took in economics, politics, sociology, kind of urban planning and design. Policy kind of making, law, etc. So a good broad understanding of kind of how we approach, and that really sort of led me towards a career in what is now called sustainability. Initially, very much focused on environmental management. I think back then, people hadn't really thought of carbon as something which needed to be managed. It was all very much around waste and resource management. So early roles were very much kind of centered around minimizing waste production through packaging waste regulations or, sort of looking at how we promote waste recovery and recycling schemes in office buildings and these sorts of things. I spent plenty of time in Tyvek and Marigolds, rooting through bin bags and sort of weighing different fractions to assess how much recyclate was being thrown out.
That's a good start.
Absolutely, yeah.
Wading through bin bags.
Definitely grounding. Yeah, absolutely. And then really that sort of led me through into the real estate sector. I've been working in real estate for the last, about 17 years ago, or so now. Very much kind of focused on property operations, initially working for a large developer and manager and owner of retail and office property called Hammerson, who are still very much a retail specialist now.
Yeah.
Again, was brought in to develop the environmental strategy for Hammerson, supporting their relatively new and first ever head of sustainability. So that was quite an exciting opportunity to go in and shape, like a large company's strategy and approach to a broader remit, not just waste, but starting to look at energy and water and sort of community engagement.
So you were kind of thinking about the things that over the last, I guess, 3 to 5 years have really become, intrinsic in the property management. So you were thinking about all these things 15 years ago.
Absolutely. And, I can pinpoint exactly the sort of trigger about when things started to change. And it's quite an interesting position to be in, because I think when a lot of people of my age and generation go into it as a pure kind of interest, and you're used to being, I always kind of say we're sort of, tolerated at best and ignored at worst, but we are given a kind of mandate to perform, and that's what we do. And as long as we're doing it quietly and not impacting too much on the wider sort of business operations, it's absolutely fine. But we've kind of seen it start to inform corporate strategy, still as a sideline item, and then gradually sort of move into being a boardroom issue, to being part of central strategy, to whereas now you really can't work with or for any organization that doesn't set a pretty robust sort of set of sustainability objectives and goals. And it's been really interesting to kind of grow up with the sector, really, and sort of end up where I am now at CBRE. So
because I guess you've gone through all the stages of it, really, because it was, I think originally it was a little bit like the new health and safety, wasn't it? Maybe 10, 12 years ago. Yeah. It was kind of we have to have it, but we're not too, whereas now, companies, at least this is how I view it. I guess contractor side, companies taking it very seriously, and it is forming part of their strategies. And this is from small organisations right up to huge, large organisations like the company that you work for. Absolutely. It's across the board, which is great. That's exactly where we need to be. So, if you were if you were developing a strategy for ESG, what would be the first things that you would do? Let's say you're a smaller organisation, you don't have the resources of a bigger one, but you want to do well. What would be the first things that you would do, the steps that you would take to, I guess, begin that journey? Yeah,
I mean, I think with anything, for a strategy to be successful, it has to have kind of meaningful outputs, meaningful objectives at the end of it, and that really requires you to really understand what we would call, what are your material issues? Like what are those aspects which you can have a specific impact on, either by reducing your negative impacts or kind of amping up your positive impacts. So the internet's a great resource. It's full of great sort of resources. If you were to look up materiality assessment on the kind of internet, there would be guidance there around what that means. But it's really around just engaging with each of your business leaders to understand exactly what their part of the organisation is responsible for, and then what the likely sort of environmental or social impacts of those parts of the organisation are, and then what you might want to do differently to kind of mitigate those impacts. Yeah. The other thing to do is, once you've identified what your material issues are, is to understand what are those performance indicators. What are those data points that you really need to be collecting and recording alongside your financial data. All businesses are used to collecting information around their financial performance. Yeah. And all businesses are used to talking about sustainability in terms of financial performance and the long-term profitability of their organizations.
So it's how you build that into the profitability of a business and make it desirable. Is that what you would?
Well, yeah, sort of understanding, what are those risks to your profitability that come from potential mismanagement of environmental aspects, or what are some of the wider societal factors which may start to impact your ability to kind of trade as you have done? So I guess one example of that would be the kind of shift that we saw a number of years ago towards contracting for the real living wage, for example. So we have the sort of statutory living wage, which is, a known requirement by law. But then we had the Living Wage Foundation that said, well, actually, that's great, but it doesn't actually go far enough to give people enough money to live on.
Agreed.
At that level. But then as a business, you need to understand how that impacts you, because you're having to pay people more money. And then that has a ripple effect up through the hierarchy of management, because clearly if that then means that somebody in a junior position is being paid as much as their supervisor, you need to increase the supervisor's wage.
There's a knock-on effect across the board.
Exactly. But then on the flip side is you look at what the benefits of paying that living wage are. So if people are more financially secure, they're likely to stay at your organization for a lot longer. So you're saving money on advertising, recruitment, training, so your staff retention improves. Their approach to their work is likely to improve as well. So their productivity may be better because they're not worrying constantly about everything like outside of work. So it's how you sort of think about your actions as a business and what that impact is, whether quantifiable or not, on your overall sort of performance as an organization. So some of these things you can measure, and we always say you can't manage what you don't measure, but some of these things also require a bit of an ideological leap of faith to say, well, actually, a happy, healthy workforce is going to be a productive workforce. We can't necessarily measure that in the short term, but maybe when we're looking back in 10 years' time, we can see that our staff retention levels increased, that we weren't losing as many staff, we were attracting better talent, these sorts of things, because you are espousing values of a company that people want to work for.
Yeah, of course, yeah. I mean, to be honest, I think, obviously I remember when the real living wage originally was incorporated and it came out, and it was a relatively slow sort of uptick. But I think now, it's far more significant. I would say, 80% of businesses, specifically, if we look at London, I would say 80% pay the London living wage. A lot of them do. And it's a great position to be in, to be fair.
And, it's all about the messaging too. And if you're an organization, why would you not want to pay your people enough money to live on? So it's not necessarily around them sort of just wanting to be paid more money. It's around actually what more can we offer them as an employer that values our employees than that. So that's kind of like one example. And I use that deliberately because we do tend to focus a lot in this sector on environmental kind of indicators and impacts. But the kind of social factors are hugely important and growing importance. Sure.
So what you're basically saying is that whilst the sustainability piece is important, it's also it's important to ensure that you deal with the social element as well. In terms of your workforce, because a happy, healthy, well-paid workforce is far more likely to, I guess, take on board initiatives from a sustainability perspective. Would that be an accurate statement, do you think?
Broadly, although we would say the social element. So if you think about sustainability as a three-legged stool, you've got your environmental, your economic, and your social aspects of that. Without one of those legs, the stool falls over.
Yes.
So you can't consider social in the absence of environmental or economic, and vice versa. So you do need to think, okay, well, one example that we use, if a client of ours says, right, we want to reduce energy consumption in our building, quickest way to reduce energy consumption is to switch everything off.
Yeah.
But switching everything off will not lead to a great experience for the occupiers of your building.
No.
So you can't just consider the energy saving in isolation. You have to consider what the impact of your energy savings are on the people who are using that kind of building. And that's really where, when it comes to thinking about, particularly from an operational point of view, some of the initiatives and projects that we're looking at, we need to try and think about, okay, what does that actually mean in practical terms for how that building operates, how it performs in practice, and will it still be attractive for people to come in and want to spend time in that building?
Yeah.
So it's considering things, side by side and making sure you're not benefiting one area at the cost of another.
Yeah. Do you have any examples of any initiatives that are taking place that broadly that you can talk about? Or
well, there are what to specifically address.
So effectively that question, I want to save money in my building. I guess is I don't want you to give any secrets away, obviously, Carl. But is there anything that you can speak about broadly in terms of some of the initiatives that either you're doing, you're involved in, ways of working which you have found to be, beneficial?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think one of the great things about the amount of data that we're collecting now is that we are able to make sort of informed decisions based on sort of quantifiable information.
Yeah.
And one sort of example of advice that we might give to a client who is, or an occupier of a building who is occupying a space in a building, is to look at how that building is performing and then look at that in relation to how they have organized their space.
Right.
So, we know operationally, and I'm sure you guys kind of come across this all the time as well, that because of the age, orientation, the materials used in a property, the floor plate of a building will not behave the same from north to south, east to west, and everything in between. So by better understanding how that space behaves based on the heating systems in there, the glazing, all of these sorts of things, you can start to identify where your kind of optimum temperate parts of the office are versus where your hard to treat overheated parts or parts of the office which are too cold.
Yeah.
So then you can take that data and you can use that to inform how you organize your space. So maybe you don't put your accounts department in the area that's going to be freezing cold all the time.
Yeah.
You move those kind of roles that who are going to be desk based Monday to Friday 9 to 5 to the most optimum parts of that floor plate, and then you move your occasional spaces into those areas which are harder to treat.
So your hot desk employees,
meeting rooms, breakout areas and things where people, more transient areas where people aren't going to be spending an awful lot of time.
Yeah.
So that's like one example, and we do kind of use that kind of level of analysis to help inform our sort of occupiers of our buildings as to how best to configure their space based on how a building behaves, and that may differ from floor to floor. Even as you get sort of like further up the building, that will change its characteristics too. Yeah. So that's just kind of one example of how we use data to ensure that we can still manage the energy aspect by not having to overheat an area that's really hard to heat, or try and overcool an area that's really hard to cool, whilst still keeping the kind of office productive and the people using the building as happy as possible.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's quite an interesting take on it. To be fair, I think is that something that would be applicable to all building types, or is it only a specific type of building where that would be?
I would say that would primarily relate to offices where you have a sort of a kind of fixed and a mobile sort of part of that workforce. More challenging in kind of retail, obviously, because retail tends to be about the location that gets the footfall. But there are similar things that we can do there just with the data again that we're collecting but that's really around assessing how a retailer who is, I don't know, a jeweler, for example, if we can collect all the data for all of the jewelers in the portfolio that we manage, we can then start to look at what the relative energy consumption per meter squared is for that jeweler. And then we could advise those jewelers who are maybe, using very little energy, ask them what their secrets are and learn from them. And those who are using huge amounts of energy, trying to work out what they're doing differently or incorrectly in their fit out, which is, sort of inflating their energy consumption.
It's probably Yorkshiremen in there, I would have thought.
Quite possibly. Yeah, absolutely.
Just don't want to spend any money.
Exactly. At the low end, for sure.
At the low end, without a doubt. Okay, so that's very interesting. So data's become an integral part of your role. Then it sounds like it's become a crucial component or an enabler for you to be able to deliver the services that you deliver.
Yeah, it's the foundational tool that we are. So once we have our data layer established, we can then use that data to create all sorts of, very kind of useful insights, which enable us to focus our subject matter expertise on risk assessment, opportunity identification, and then how that then feeds into a wider improvement plan for that property or fund.
Right.
So without that data layer, you're just guessing. You're just kind of guessing, based on averages and benchmarks and X, Y, and Z. Without a good, strong foundation of data, everything else is guesswork, or you're going to be running the risk of jumping to the wrong conclusions.
Yeah,
and we see it all the time. We see clients who will look at their portfolio, they won't have any data, and they'll jump straight to getting a dozen energy audits done across their portfolio. Now, if they'd have had a good data layer to start with, they might identify that actually 4 of those buildings are behaving perfectly fine as they are, and 8 of the buildings are the ones which need a bit of a helping hand. So instead of paying for 12, pay for 8. And then, or first of all, look at what those 4 buildings are doing well to see what can translate into the other 8 before you even think about, sort of investing in that kind of study. And that's really where our role starts to come in as property managers, where we, in the role that we have kind of established for ourselves in this kind of ESG function, is just around making sure that we have access to good quality data. We can support those clients with more advanced ESG strategies, but we can also guide clients who maybe aren't quite sure how it applies to them, where the where there is risk in their portfolio, what that risk means in terms of potential medium to long-term value, and then what we could potentially do operationally to mitigate that risk, and at what point investment might be required. And that will then start to inform their whole sort of investment strategy for that building or fund.
That's quite interesting. So is there a in terms of collating that data, is there a set period of time that you would ideally want to be able to produce that information, or is it very much building specific and environment specific?
We try to collect data regularly, and we try and set up systems within the organisation to ensure that data is available to us on a regular basis. That period is often dictated by our suppliers and providers, and obviously some data, different data sources are available at different frequencies. But we generally work with our more advanced clients to a quarterly reporting KPI, to our maybe sort of developing clients to like an annual sort of overarching sort of report. We do try, once we are mobilizing, we do try and obtain as much historic data as we can. We generally have 2018 as a bit of a sort of arbitrary sort of point in time where we want to get information from. CBRE's targets at the moment are based on a 2019 baseline. So collecting data from 2018 means we have a good data set.
Of course.
Fortunately, in hindsight, it's a wonderful thing. That was also very helpful because 2020, the world went a bit wobbly.
It did go a bit wobbly.
It certainly did. So we had 2 good years of pre-pandemic data to look at actual building performance before things started to go a little bit south. 2020 and 2021.
That's good. So I'm guessing when the world did go wobbly. That kind of changes everything, doesn't it? From a data perspective, because there's nobody in the office. Things need to change, so you perhaps have to start thinking about things differently because how we work has changed.
Yes, it absolutely does, but maybe not quite as much as you'd think.
Oh, really?
And actually, from a property management perspective, the pandemic really enabled our sector to show our clients the value that we bring to them and their sort of overall operations, their sort of funds. I think prior to that, I think our role was starting to be respected far more. But I think, after that point where, yes, the offices may have been empty of people, but that's still where the server rooms are. It's still where the data centres are. It's still a skeleton staff that need to attend that. And actually, if you're operating an office building, particularly, if you've got 3 people or 300 people in there, you are probably using a similar amount of energy. Maybe you're saving a little bit on vertical transportation, but the lights are generally on, the HVAC's generally working. You can't always isolate one.
The heating on the aircon's generally on.
It might not even be advantageous to do that because if you're not conditioning the whole building, you're risking systems not working at all. When you try and start back up again, you're risking damage to the interiors of buildings with kind of mold and mildew and these sorts of things happening if you're not kind of having those air circulation changes. So yes, we saw that big drop off when the first lockdowns happened, but then it was a gradual climb back up, and it got back. The savings weren't as pronounced as you would think.
Really?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. That's really interesting. So how has things like, modern technology, specifically AI, how has that impacted, that sustainability journey, and how has it, or how has it helped? Or how do you see it helping in the future?
Yeah.
Is there did you have a view on that?
Yeah, sure. Technology has made far more data and information available to us. It's also enabled us to kind of, corral information from various disparate sources into one place. We can start to lay different data sets over each other. And we're doing far, far more of that. So we have those kind of software platform solutions. We use a platform ourselves. We work with master systems integrators, but then we also work on point solutions when it comes to whether it be, sort of smart metering solutions, or whether it be sort of lighting control solutions, or, electrification solutions, like air source heat pumps, these sorts of things. So technology plays a huge role in what we do, and I work incredibly closely with our sort of head of smart building and digital strategy, because we want to be making sure that we're working with the right partners to deliver the right solutions, and we're able to integrate the outcomes of those products into our overall overarching reporting. So super exciting. We've got, CBRE has a lot of data. That data is held in a lot of different systems. As a business, we see the value in trying to see what we can do to take our respective data lakes and create a data ocean, and then use the content of that data ocean to give, the best advice to clients, drive the best research outputs through our fantastic research team, to really start to kind of give that sort of picture of where real estate has been, where it is now, and where it could potentially be going.
Right. So quite exciting times in the future, then, you think?
Very much so. Yeah. And we know that building operations is a fundamentally important part of the challenge. When we think about the Paris Climate Agreement, we know we have to achieve net zero carbon by 2050. We also know UK GBC sort of statistics that 80% of the buildings that will be standing in 2050 are here today.
Right.
So this is not a question of us designing these incredible glulam buildings, which are fully electrified with, kind of solar arrays and all the rest of it. It's around what do we do with this building? What do we do with the buildings in, all through Chinatown and Soho? What do we do with these
listed buildings?
Yeah,
the buildings
exactly.
that were built in the 16th century. How do you refit them?
All the buildings that were built in the 70s, 80s, and 90s when it was, the efficient construction of inefficient buildings.
Exactly.
So that's the legacy.
Asbestos and concrete.
Yeah, absolutely. Incredibly intensive. So management has an enormous role to play in understanding the potential of the built environment stock as it exists now, and what we can actually do with it in the future.
So where do you see that heading, Carl?
Well, where do we see that heading? I think there would have to be an awful lot more investment in ways to create decarbonisation at scale outside of the building. So we're looking at large scale investments in renewable energy supplies, for example. We do know, however, that the best estimates with the renewable capacity, say for the UK, for example, will not be sufficient to keep pace with electrical demand. So there's a huge amount that we need to do around improving the efficiency of buildings. This isn't something we're just going to be able to sit on our hands and wait for energy suppliers to invest in offshore wind and solar and all of these sorts of things. That's part of the solution. But we need to look at how we drive down energy use intensity, energy density within buildings as well. Think about how we're specifying buildings or re-specifying at end of life. Invariably, there will be buildings where their use will be changed from commercial to residential. We're already seeing that. And there may well be kind of buildings which fall by the wayside, where they are hard to treat in bad locations. And when all the calculations around embodied carbon are done, they get pulled down and redeveloped.
Really?
So there's no one single solution, but we need to be aware and using our expertise to advise clients on what the likely best outcome for a given building would be.
Yeah. You said something quite interesting there about commercial properties transitioning to residential. Do you think that has a larger resource allocation from an energy perspective if we're talking residential as opposed to commercial?
Quite possibly it does.
Yeah.
But for the property owner, it makes it a different problem.
Yes. Yeah. True.
So it doesn't eliminate the problem. I mean, we see, and I'm absolutely not naming names here, but we see companies who will report annually and claim huge reductions in energy consumption. But when you look at how that's achieved, it's because they've sold a bunch of very energy intensive buildings.
Okay.
So there is something around looking at absolute emissions in the round sector by sector to work out are we reducing UK PLC or whatever country you're focusing on, the consumption overall, or are you just shifting the problem from your sort of environmental balance sheet onto somebody else's?
Okay. Right, I'm going to ask you more of a personal question here than a professional one. Okay. So obviously renewables are renewables. We know that renewables aren't going to power the future at the minute in the present condition. Do you think there's any alternative to fossil fuels right now that could be viable and could transition us away from fossil fuels effectively, like hydrogen or I don't know, battery? I don't know.
Well, I mean, battery storage is obviously going to be key to ensure that when we do have renewable arrays and energy is being generated in peak renewable generation time, which may not be when it's needed, so we can actually store that kind of all of that capacity.
Because that's the issue, isn't it? It's more the storage than
exactly,
because the wind doesn't always blow and the sun isn't always shining and things like that. So it's how we store the energy once we've got it.
Yeah, exactly. And just to make sure that that can be trickled into the grid as required. There is no silver bullet when it comes to the energy transition, but the energy transition has to be prioritizing a shift towards renewables. So fossil fuels are likely to play a role in our energy mix for the rest of our lifetimes. You could look at nuclear, but actually the lead times for projects is huge. There are, the kind of carbon, the embodied carbon of those kind of facilities is absolutely enormous as well. And we've seen what's been happening with some of the kind of proposed nuclear developments and how those projects get delayed. It doesn't solve for that issue now.
Well, the waste as well is a big issue.
Well, the waste is absolutely a huge issue as well. And people discuss fusion. That's not going to happen in our lifetimes either, in any commercial sense. So
haven't they? I think they've done that now, haven't they? A very small scale. But they did manage to achieve fusion power for 0.001 millimeter second or something like that.
Absolutely. So probably not going to meet the demand of
not right now,
of all of our kids' smartphones and things for sure.
No.
So
what about hydrogen? Is hydrogen?
Hydrogen. I mean, I don't profess to be an expert in hydrogen. There is a fantastic paper that was published by a chap called Michael Liebrich.
Right.
He has a podcast as well. So with a slightly different focus, but he published a really, really good summary of what hydrogen is good for and what hydrogen isn't necessarily good for, and where we should be focusing the kind of use of hydrogen. But ultimately, it may solve some issues, but it's definitely not the silver bullet, and it's not going to be the thing that saves us. And where we've seen buildings that have tried to be early adopters with hydrogen fuel cells, we've also seen that those hydrogen fuel cells don't stay in operation for very long.
Really? So there's a fundamental issue with how they...
At the moment, maybe the technology it isn't quite mature enough now for that that application, or maybe it's just not the reliability is not there. But it's I mean, like I say, it's not a huge area of focus for us. We don't talk to our utilities bureau services teams and think about hydrogen. We think about renewables, better quality renewables, lower carbon fossil fuel sources, these sorts of things. Those are the discussions.
There was a lot of talk as well about tidal, wasn't there? Because obviously the UK's got a lot of tidal rivers.
It absolutely has.
And that sort of that tidal, it was like some kind of snake thing I saw.
Yeah.
That could be, I don't know, it could straddle the Thames at about a mile.
The Severn
was
a project
the Severn
we're looking at,
and things like that. And then as the water comes in and then goes back out.
Yeah.
And that would apparently generate a significant amount of energy.
Enormous.
It's basically like a hydro dam, isn't it? It's a similar kind of principle.
Similar principle, but I mean, I think the beauty with something like tidal is that isn't contingent on the sun shining or
it happens every day, no matter twice a day, every day.
As long as the moon's in the sky.
Yeah.
And if the moon's not in the sky, we'll have bigger problems.
We will do. Yeah, very much so. Very much so. Yeah, I think we'll probably fly off towards the sun or something.
Well, quite. Yeah. Hurtle.
Yeah, hurtle towards us. Okay. That's really interesting. Thank you very much. So, in terms of where your career is now, and where do you see sustainability being in, let's say, 10 years' time? Do you, because obviously there's been a significant shift in the time that you've been 25 years, you've operated in the industry. Now it's an incredibly important part of business. Where do you see it being in 10 years?
Broadly, in a very similar place to where it is now, but in a much more established, integrated capacity. I think more companies will be looking at how they resource for sustainability. There'll be a lot more of an understanding that sustainability is a discipline that is just part of a core business operation now. We just employed a CBRE last year, our first ever chief sustainability officer, CSO, right. Rob Bernard. And I think we'll see companies like CBRE and smaller. I mean, we are a bit of a beast.
The big green machine.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we'll see that CSO role, that C-suite sustainability presence far more dominant than it is now. So
across business.
Yeah. So alongside the CFO and the chief operations officer and the CEO and everything, it'll be part of that C-suite of services because it is going to be fundamentally important to, we talked about materiality earlier, and we talked about how we can minimize impact on the planet or on people or whatever, but there's a duality to materiality, and we think about double materiality. So we start to think about what are those risks that are out there to our business. So how will the environment bite us back? How will demographic shifts impact our operating model? Yeah. So, having that sort of view of sustainability as a system and being able to kind of like think in with a systems mindset is going to be increasingly key, because we could do all we can to minimize the energy that we're using. But ultimately, we know we are seeing the impacts of climate change writ large year on year. We are seeing it all the time. We see the impacts of rising sea levels or ultra high tides or localized flooding after huge periods of heavy rain. We see the impacts of those, and we see the buildings which have the basements flooded or they're inaccessible. This is part of our sort of life now. Yeah, we've seen the impact that's been having on the insurance industry for years. So now it's going to have a material impact on whether a person can get to a building or what the value of that building is if it's in a location which is likely to be impacted by that. Yeah. So those sorts of roles are really key to ensure that we are aware of what we need to do to play our part as a good corporate citizen, but also how do we mitigate against the risk that we're facing because of these huge global trends that we're seeing. So so much more literacy around it.
There's a big social risk to it as well, though, isn't there? Because it's an expensive thing to do, and because it's expensive, it impacts people's lives, like everybody's on the street and things like that. So there's a big social element to it as well, whereby you've got to sell it to the populace to say, look, this is why we're doing it. It needs to be done. Yeah. Here's the rationale behind it. But as things become more difficult, you tend to find that voting trends change. Do you know what I mean? There is that, and I don't want to be too controversial.
I was going to say there is a danger of kind of moving towards kind of like political ideological positions here, but I think
not what I want to do.
I think there are genuine reasons why there is a perception that it is more expensive to do that, because it's seen as being something that is quite novel. Ultimately, the sun shines whether we pay for it or not.
Yeah, that's true.
Whereas if we go and fill our car up at the petrol station, we can't drive away without paying. So, if you are able to kit your house out to be fully off-grid and fully sort of sustainable, and you have an electric car, you are not contributing towards the economy. So I think this is the challenge we have. There is a challenge of perception, and there is a challenge of familiarity. And I think we are familiar with how things are running now, and humans ostensibly are scared of change.
Yes.
And especially if they feel it's going to, limit. So actually, I think we as an industry, the role that we have to play is to kind of demonstrate that sustainability will not do those things. It doesn't mean we're all going to be living in caves. It doesn't mean we're all going to be walking everywhere. It doesn't mean to say we can't have a holiday in Spain each year. It doesn't mean we can't go and buy our avocados or our almonds or whatever they are. But these are these kind of tropes that we see all the time, and you have to look at where that information or misinformation is coming from and question the sources.
Agreed. It's quite interesting, isn't it? Because I think human beings, we're really good at mitigation, but not very good at being like pro-positive, like positive in terms of our approach to something, because it means massive change, and we're not very good at that. But we're good at mitigation. That's what we tend to do well. We love a disaster, don't we? Well, listen, Carl, tell us a bit about yourself outside of work. What do you like to do?
If you weren't a bit unsure about me as being a potential tree hugger, I'm also a very keen cyclist, which I guess is maybe a bit on brand. I kind of always kind of say that actually, if the more carbon bikes you buy, the less carbon there is in the atmosphere. I'm not too sure that really plays true from a scientific perspective, but it enables me to feel comfortable buying.
Makes you feel good.
Absolutely. I've got a amazing wife at home and two teenage daughters.
Really? Yeah. Well, they keep you busy, teenage daughters?
They do. Where one's just going through her GCSEs this year.
Oh, wow.
Big year, leaving school, starting college.
Yeah.
Between the kind of fitness and the family and the work, that pretty much keeps me pretty occupied.
Yeah, definitely. Well, listen, Carl, that brings us to the end of the podcast. How did you find it?
Well, that went incredibly quickly.
It does, doesn't it? It's amazing,
it really
isn't it?
It's been great to chat, and thank you for the thought you put into the questions.
No problem at all. I really appreciate the fact that I asked you some relatively challenging ones there as well, I suppose. put you on the step a little bit, yes. But thank you for giving us your interpretation of things. talking us through sustainability, what the future looks like, how it is so data orientated. I found that incredibly interesting, and the type of data that you can pull from, facilities, buildings, factories, and so on and so forth. So thank you very much.
Like we always say, you wouldn't go on holiday without a map.
So. Very true. There needs to be a guide, doesn't there?
Indeed.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
All right, Cal, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure having you here.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. Thanks very much.
All right, listeners, that's the end of another Wear Many Hats episode. Really interesting one with Cal. Obviously went through some very diverse, interesting topics with regards to sustainability. I'm sure Cal would be happy if you reached out to him on LinkedIn if you have any questions. But that's the end of another episode. Thank you very much. As ever, if you can't be good, be bad. See you later.